Retro games have become expensive. So much so that they've gone from being games to being collectibles. They're graded, auctioned, and resold as though they're classic pieces of art. And with high prices come the complaints. And there's a lot of them. I've complained, you've probably complained, and really, who wouldn't? Games that once sold brand new at retail for $40 to $70 can now be found on secondhand markets for hundreds of dollars, some even in the thousands. So who's responsible for this? And what's the one thing that people seem to not be talking about very much when it comes to the conversation of the high prices of retro video games? Well, there's a lot of subjects to explore when it comes to the high price of retro video games. Factor number one is one that I think we can all agree on. And that's the reality of supply and demand. Physical media is finite. When something is gone, it's gone. And if more people want that physical item and there's only a few of them to go around, naturally the price goes up to the highest bidder. But then what does that say about game series like Mario or Pokemon, where even though there's millions of copies of these games that were sold, the demand for them keeps on going up, and it still continues to outpace the physical supply of the games that are there. And though they didn't sell in the millions like Mario or Pokemon, more niche genres like horror and JRPGs, those games only seem to explode in price as the years go on, and passionate fans find classics in the genre. A game that didn't do huge numbers during its original release cycle might later on develop a cult following and see its prices skyrocket. See what I did there? Skyrocket! But ultimately, what drives demand for retro video games? Factor number one driving demand is cultural factors. Think, for example, of what happened during the pandemic. Games that were once affordable suddenly exploded in price as everyone is stuck indoors. And if you can't go outside and do a bunch of social stuff, it makes sense that a lot of people would turn to video games, especially ones that they loved playing in their childhood. Games that people were paying $20 to $30 for before the pandemic suddenly could be found on eBay for $50 to $60. The other factor is just cultural curiosity. When you see news reports of things like your old Nintendo 64 games selling for $1 million, you can't help but wonder if what you've got in the basement is actually something quite valuable. When things sell at a high amount, people perceive it to be very valuable because someone valued it at $1 million or $1,000 or even $40 when before it was much cheaper. And when something is perceived of as being valuable, it's not very likely that that price is going to go down anytime soon, unless the market crashes, which it still hasn't done yet. The other factor that I think might be driving some of this demand is modern gaming. In the 80s and 90s, though a lot of us played games, you'd be something of a social pariah if you called yourself a gamer. However, today it's completely switched. My kids were telling me a story of being at a playground and someone randomly saying, "Are you a gamer?" And when my kids said, "Yes, we play Mario and Nintendo games," they said, "Well, you're not really a gamer." The idea that that's cultural currency to be a gamer, when as before, it was a cultural liability to be seen as a gamer, something switched. And I think that makes people want to revisit the old classics as well. After all, Xbox, Sony, and Nintendo all have ways that you can download or purchase classic games from their earlier catalogs to play and enjoy today. But one of the other groups of people that get blamed for the high prices of video games are YouTubers. Every time a creator highlights a hidden gem, the price of that game seems to explode. I can't help but think that when YouTubers talk about classic video games, it naturally would drive demand because it's interesting to learn about the old games and want to experience them for yourself. Although that's also morphed into some thinking that retro YouTubers are somehow intentionally trying to drive the price of video games to be higher so that they can sell those games and make a profit. But the logic on that way of thinking falls apart pretty quick for me. So what you're saying is that if you're at the level of making videos that get tens if not hundreds of thousands of views per video, and you're gonna put in all of that effort to concept the video, shoot the video, and edit the video, which is that's gonna say take 20 to 40 hours to do, that 20 to 40 hours is gonna then make a price of a game go up by 20, 30, or let's say even $100. That means you're making about $2 extra an hour or so, depending on the game. I don't buy it. But I can also understand how maddening it is when games like Piglet's Big Game become worth hundreds of dollars because someone talks about how it looks like it's influenced by Silent Hill, or maybe it actually was, because all of a sudden that $20 game at best becomes worth $150. I get it. So maybe you're someone who gets caught up in the demand and decides you want to buy one of those old classic retro video games. Who are you going to buy it from? And the answer to that question is a group of people who are among the most hated and most blamed for the high price of retro video games. Resellers. The logic goes something like this. Resellers go to garage sales, thrift stores, and flea markets. They buy up all the game inventory, and then they hoard it all and set the price, and that becomes the market price. Resellers are just greedy hoarders. When people want to buy retro games and collectibles, they have to buy them from the whatnot resellers, from the YouTubers who resell, and from the eBayers, and they gotta buy them at the prices that they set. But they should be setting them at cheaper prices because Their video games? For some reason, if someone finds a video game for cheap, they are under some kind of obligation to sell it cheap as well because it's a video game. I don't notice any other categories of collectibles that get this kind of rules put on it. And I don't know why video games end up being the thing that people seem to be the most critical of when it comes to resellers. It doesn't matter what the market price is for the game. If you got it for cheap, you're obligated to sell it for cheap as well. But I do want to mention, this does not excuse people who engage in shady behavior. Resellers who don't know what they're talking about when it comes to retro video games, and they overinflate prices beyond what's reasonable. Many of us have been to stores, conventions, or other places where it doesn't seem that people know what they've got, and they're asking for absurd prices on things. While I do appreciate the hustle and grind when it comes to building a business, whether it's reselling video games or doing anything else, sometimes people do resort to dirty tactics when it comes to reselling video games. Pressuring people to make deals that they're obviously uncomfortable making. When it comes to conventions, cutting in line early and getting ahead of people who paid for VIP passes to buy games. Outright lying about the price of an item or downplaying it when someone asks you how much something is worth. I don't think dishonesty is a very good policy. But even the resellers who are playing fair, how come they end up being the bad guys as well? One presumption I have is that sometimes people get so excited to buy an item and they spend maybe $100 on, let's say, a Pokemon game, and are so excited to finally play it and relive it again. But then when they get home and maybe the dust has settled from the purchase, they maybe went a little past their budget, they start to feel a little bit bad about, why did I spend so much on this game? Who gets the blame for that? Well, the reseller does, because that's who they bought it from. The demand is the thing that ultimately sets the price. In fact, if you want to change this, what you have to do is stop buying from resellers. But the disproportionate amount of criticism that resellers get when it comes to selling retro video games and collectibles when compared to other similar markets is noticeable. But there's still another reseller factor that I think does count for something here in this conversation. And it's the demand not just from buyers, but from sellers. A lot of people who resell have seen the price of retro video games go up, and there's some basic rules that are pretty easy to follow. The older the game, the higher likelihood the value, and it seems like everyone has become a reseller. So now if there's demand from people who want to play these older games, and also demand from people who want to buy them to sell them to those people, that's a lot of demand. And sometimes resellers resort to scummy tactics in order to get ahead of other resellers, not just other buyers. But even beyond everything that's been discussed when it comes to the high price of video games so far, there's still one factor that I think is bigger than anything else, and it's the one that I hear people talking the least about. The demand for retro video games and collectibles isn't fueled by sellers, it's fueled by buyers. Ultimately, you and I are responsible for the high prices of retro video games. As buyers, we're the ones bringing the money to the table. If we don't like the price, the item sits, which then forces sellers to have to lower the price to meet the actual market demand that someone is willing to pay for the item. The less you buy, the more the price goes down in order to move the inventory off the shelf. When we spend our money on something, we are determining its value based on what we're willing to pay for it. But still, buyers don't seem to stop buying. Last year I kicked off a series where I spent the entire year buying and reselling video games in order to build the funds to complete my Nintendo 64 collection by buying one last manual that I needed that was worth a couple $1,000s. But the fact is, I chose to do this. No one forced me, and I have to admit, it was a really fun experience. But if, like me, you've ever spent more than the original retail price of a classic video game, congratulations. You are partly responsible for raising the price of classic video games. Collectibles are the definition of unnecessary. They aren't food, water, shelter, or clothing. They're ultimately just things. But many of us, myself included, have spent more time and resources on trying to find unnecessary collectible things in place of things that actually matter, like health, relationships, family, and spiritual growth. So really, instead of being upset at what's going on with the high price of collectibles and everything going on around you, I would encourage you instead to look inside yourself. Here's a few things that I think are worth calling out. And before I go further, yes, I recognize the hypocrisy of saying all this standing in front of a giant wall of video games. And yet at the same time, these are questions I've been going through in my own personal life, and it's led to some changes in the way that I live. When I think about what causes me to go beyond my financial means or to spend more time than I should on this stuff, one of the emotional drivers that pushes me past those boundaries really comes down to FOMO. FOMO, or the fear of missing out, is the idea that if I don't get something right now, it's not going to be available to me later. In which case, I would say most of the things in my life, especially everything when it comes to this world of collectibles, I can only think of maybe one or two times when I've been like, oh man, it's so much more expensive now. And I end up having to sort of spend a little bit more money on it later. But in the meantime, that might cause me to spend a bunch of money on stuff as soon as it comes out, and it ultimately sits on the shelf and doesn't do anything. One of the biggest ways I noticed this negatively impacting my life was how I collected for the PlayStation Vita. When Vita games went on sale at Limited Run or Play Asia or other retail releases, I would get up at whatever time I had to be there to make sure I could buy the game as soon as it was released at retail. And then I would get the game, put it on my shelf, and be like, I'm gonna play that later. And I would never play it. Finally, I'm sitting there looking at this giant wall of games going, I'm not gonna play half of these. I did a whole video about this where I went through the collection and sold half the games. And even today, I have plans to sell a lot more because I just know I'm not gonna be able to get to them. So ultimately, while I do really enjoy the PlayStation Vita, I think a lot of my collecting for it was really not good habits. A lot of it was some of my impulsiveness or the fear of missing out and just thinking the prices are gonna get so much more expensive later. But ultimately it just sat on my shelf. I know so many collectors who have bought into this idea that I need to get something now before it gets super expensive later, only to have many cases where those games get reprinted, those amiibos get reprinted, or you find that item for cheap somewhere else, or you just fork out the money, and really when you compare the amount of money that you might have overspent based on all the time you saved, I think you made the better choice to just wait until you were ready to actually play and enjoy the game. The other thing that I think is worth exploring internally is why we're willing to pay more from some people and less from others, specifically people that we watch on the internet. A lot of our favorite YouTubers and other personalities have different platforms they use to sell online, all fine and good. But sometimes we feel a bit of an obligation when we're in those shows or rooms where we feel like we've got to spend more, and it's almost this sense of like, wanting to make sure that like we're cool with that other person. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but if you've ever overspent because you're excited to buy from someone, maybe there's a value in that for you, and I'm not gonna judge that. But ultimately, at some point, you have to ask yourself, why do I feel compelled to buy more or to spend more on a certain personality that I really enjoy, rather than just to pay the retail price otherwise? I get it. There's a sense of community. There's a sense of trust. I have my own platforms that I sell on. But sometimes when people way overspend, I think sometimes they get caught up in wanting to appear as though they're special or something like that to someone else. We use terms like parasocial relationships to explain this phenomenon. But maybe the biggest factor, especially in myself, is just a general sense of impulsiveness. That sense of a lack of ability to say no because you just want to have something. I go through a few different steps to manage my feelings of impulsiveness, and they don't just come up for video games, it comes up for a lot of things in my life. Usually I can first recognize when the feeling is an impulsive feeling, and when you develop some of that self-awareness, you realize, oh, I need to do something about this. So for me, I put on myself a temporary week-long or month-long sort of holding period where I'm like, I can't make this purchase unless I really want to get the thing at the end of that period of time. And that doesn't mean it's video games only. It could be for production gear, amazing cardigans, or some other sort of thing in my life that is cool, but is ultimately not essential. But ultimately, it's an invitation to ask yourself this question: why do I need to have this thing so badly? And when you can answer that question, it may be connected to something much deeper that's really worth exploring. And looking inward is far less interesting than blaming everyone else and resellers and everyone for the cause of your problems and why stuff is too expensive or whatever else. Be careful. The more that we say that the rest of the world is the cause of your problems, and the less you look at your contribution to those problems, the more you become a victim. Now, I say all of this with the utmost sensitivity. A lot of people have been through the unspeakable. A lot of people have been victimized by really terrible people and terrible circumstances, and I don't mean to excuse any of that behavior or somehow suggest that you are responsible for that behavior. What I am trying to say is that we are responsible for our own behavior and what we choose to do, and that can be really, really difficult. Whenever I take the time to go inward, it's not to shame myself for my behaviors, my thoughts, or my feelings. It's to bring awareness to what's there and to ask, what can I do about it? I don't blame the fast food industry for making me overweight. I look at my own impulsiveness and my lack of discipline around my food habits in general. I'm responsible for what I decide to do with the food when I'm craving something that's really not good for me. So when it comes to the high prices of collectibles and retro video games and why things are so crazy, I think we have to first ask ourselves, what about the demand in us? That demand isn't something that anyone can force us to feel. It's something that we just feel in response to something we experience. So what are you experiencing? And if it brings up something to you that you think is worth digging in on, ask a friend. Hey, have you noticed this stuff in me? What do you think? Or maybe even see a therapist or a close community member, a pastor, whoever, and explore this a little deeper. And if it makes you healthier in the long run, good for you. I know that since I got the manual, I've been going through my collection and selling chunk by chunk of it to get down to and curate the best stuff that I want in my collection. including selling a lot of Pokemon stuff, selling a lot of just random games and collectibles that are oversized that I don't really have room for, nor that I really want. And I keep going through different things to sort of get to the best, most fun collection to have, to play and enjoy. But that's my journey. What's yours? What's helped you? And what do you think of all of this? Where am I getting it wrong? Where am I getting it right? And whatever the case may be, thanks for hearing me out. I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to seeing you more this year.